Welcome back to beginner watercolor exercises where I want to help you build confidence. In this video, we will learn about blends, bleeds, and blooms. Hi there, I'm Audrey, your watercolor bestie, and welcome to my studio. If you like this video and want to start your watercolor journey, I have a free course, Watercolor Basics for the Absolute Beginner, and you can sign up using the link in the description below. Let me first define the terms I'm going to demonstrate and then dive deeper. Blend. A blend happens when you soften edges or create a smooth transition from one color to the next. Bleed. A bleed occurs when paint seeps or bleeds into another area. It looks similar to a bloom, but it's still a little bit unique because a bloom occurs when you introduce water or a very watery paint into an area that is already drying. And there are some unique characteristics that go with that. Let's look at our supplies. I'll be using the LUKAS brand that you can get from Jerry's Artarama. And I really like LUKAS because they're artist grade quality for student grade prices. And they're very creamy and rich in color. I'm going to use the round shape and sizes 6, 3, and 2 for the majority of my demonstrations. The 6 will probably be the most used. And for paper, I'm using the Canson brand, cold press, and I just cut them into small pieces. I also have a jar of water, paper towel, and a spray bottle with water. Let's first look at blending. There are two types of blending I want to discuss in this video. The first is how to blend out edges, and the second is how to blend two colors on paper. In part 1, we discuss wet on dry technique, one of the most common techniques. The wet on dry creates this harsh line. So let's say that I want to soften that edge and make it look hazy. Even if it's dry, as long as the paint is not very staining, then it can be reactivated easily and reworked. Okay, so I have this painted square here and the edges are just about to dry. They're not completely dry, but it's on its way. So I'm going to take my round size 6 brush, I'm going to wet it and then just blot it a little bit so it's a little damp. Then I'm going to softly rub the edge until the pigments are reactivated. You see that? And just soften out that line. Then I can draw it out further if I want to, or whatever you're going to do. And there you go. Now you really want to be careful with how wet your brush is because that's where bleeds and blooms are going to come in. And you can already see that kind of happening right here. Let's try it again. I have another square here and I'll soften that edge out again. I'm just taking a damp, clean brush and just kind of rub that edge just to release the pigments and soften that line. Another way of using the blend technique is to blend colors. So let's start with a light blue, just using my ultramarine blue. And now I'm going to introduce a new color. And then while this blue is still wet, I'm just going to introduce that in there and allow them to mix in the middle. And then blend out the rest. What we just did is actually also called a variegated wash, but we'll dive more deeper into that later. Now, these kinds of blends can be intentional or not. So a blend where you intentionally took an edge and softened it out, that is intentional, that was purposeful. But a blend where you have two colors coming together, that could be a little less intentional and that could just happen spontaneously, which is why we're going to talk about bleeds and blooms next. But blending on the paper as opposed to blending on the palette is another great way to just kind of observe what happens to the paints when they're coming together. Next, let's look at bleeds. So lay down one color. And I'm gonna take that same yellow as before. I'm gonna start painting, but then creep closer and closer to that blue area until they kind of touch. And then you can kind of push the pigment, I don't know if you can see that pigment blob, but push it into that blue area. So watercolor bleed happens when paint expands beyond the originally painted area. Usually it's into another, wet painted area. And this can happen intentionally or by accident. So let's try the bleed again. And this time, instead of 2 colors, we'll do it with 1 color. And then instead of with the yellow, we'll use just clean water. So let me start with that blue again. Let me add a little bit more pigment just to see, you can see what happens. Okay, and this time I'm going to use a clean damp brush and then creep a little closer and closer until you touch it, and then you can see the blue just kind of expanding beyond that original blue circle area into this new clean water area. I can go to another edge and do it. As long as that blue is still wet, it will move. All right, so those are bleeds. Now, a bloom happens when the painted area is semi-dry. So the ones that we just did, we caused the bleed when it was still very wet. It's tougher to do the bloom when the painted area has already dried. The bloom technique has a lot of other names. It can also be known as a blossom or a cauliflower, or sometimes even a back run, like all those things. And again, a bloom can also be intentional or by accident. And you can tell it's a bloom and not a bleed by the scalloped edges. So let's paint a blue area, and then I'll wait for it to kind of dry. So let me explain a little bit of the science behind it. So what happens when you add a watery brush, or it can just be clean water or even watery paint, into this semi-dry area, what's going to happen is that the water is going to push the pigment particles away from itself. And so what you'll get is like this bare spot, and then the paint pigments have been pushed out to the edge of that water droplet. And so that's why you get those scalloped edges. And so let's go ahead and do that now. It's, on its way to drying. I'm gonna put my brush in the water, and then without blotting it, I'm just gonna introduce a water blob. And you might not see the effect happening immediately, but you can start to see that there's another circle happening within that blue circle. You can start to see that dark blue line happening right there. And so basically that water droplet kind of bloomed in that blue area. And now you can really see that dark blue edge happening. So that's that scallop I was talking about. I'll be honest, I don't actually use blooms intentionally. It happens to be mostly by accident. So sometimes I'm just washing out my brush and a water droplet kind of flies out of my jar, or maybe I'm switching out my brushes and I didn't dry my brush enough and a droplet goes flying. So it happens, but like a bleed and like blends, think of blooms as happy accidents because it can add a very interesting character to your paintings. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you learned something new. Remember to have fun with these techniques. Half the fun with watercolor is literally going with the flow and observing what happens. Remember, I have a free course, Watercolor Basics for the Absolute Beginner, so you can learn more about these techniques. There are more parts to this series, so like this video, subscribe to this channel, and leave a comment down below and share about your experience with these techniques. Happy painting!